So today, she told you what she was going to do for the day.
Yeah.
And what was that?
Take the dog for a walk, and then she is going to the store to buy for Christmas morning breakfast tomorrow. She's gonna make gingerbread cookies for tonight.
He was calm. His demeanor wasn't urgent. He didn't have that sense of urgency that you would expect, that you saw from other people.
You guys haven't had any problems, marriage problems. Everything's good. You've been married 4 years.
Yeah.
He just doesn't seem like the guy whose wife is missing. In the initial hours where normally you would think the husband would be like, stop talking to me and get out there and find my wife. You know, I didn't do it, leave me alone. But he just didn't, he had something about him and the way he was answering questions, his demeanor was suspicious.
Okay, did you drive straight there?
I did.
Get your boat in. How long do you think you stayed in the water?
Felt like an hour and a half or so.
On Christmas Eve 2002, Scott Peterson told police he had spent the morning fishing alone on San Francisco Bay, 90 miles from their home in Modesto, California. He said he had launched his 14-foot aluminum boat from the Berkeley Marina at around 9:30 in the morning. He fished for about an hour. He came home. When he arrived back in Modesto, his wife Laci was gone. That was his alibi. He had been fishing. 4 months later, on April 13 and 14, 2003, the body of a male fetus and the badly decomposed torso of a woman washed ashore on the eastern shores of San Francisco Bay, about 2 miles from the Berkeley Marina, about 2 miles from where Scott Peterson said he had been fishing alone on Christmas Eve. The woman was identified as Laci Peterson. The fetus was their unborn son, Connor. Laci was 8 months pregnant when she disappeared. She was 27 years old. Now here is the thing. Most people know this. Most people know Scott Peterson killed Laci. What most coverage of this case has never properly explained is the forensic picture underneath the alibi. The science that investigators used to place Scott Peterson at that specific location in that bay on that morning. The cement, the anchors, the tides, the GPS tracker, the fishing rod that proved he was lying about why he was even there. That is what we are covering today. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand why this case was never as circumstantial as the defense wanted the jury to believe. Welcome back, everyone. I am really glad you are here for this one. Before we get into the forensic evidence, and we are going to go deep on it, let me tell you who Laci Peterson was, because she deserves to be known as more than the victim in her husband's case. If you're new here, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. I cover cases like this every week. The full forensic picture, the parts that get glossed over, the current developments most channels have already forgotten to follow up on. You are in the right place. Now, let me tell you about Laci. Laci Denise Rocha was born on May 4th, 1975, in Escalon, California. She grew up in Modesto, studied ornamental horticulture at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, Cal Poly, and met Scott Peterson there at a restaurant where she worked. They married on August 9th, 1997. Everyone who knew Laci described her the same way. Warm, spirited, someone who made every gathering better just by being in it. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, has spent more than 20 years speaking publicly about her daughter. And the picture she paints is of a woman who genuinely loved her life. She was passionate about cooking. She loved her garden. She was excited about the baby. They had already named him Connor, had already decorated the nursery, had already started telling people about plans for his arrival. She was 8 months pregnant. She was due on February 10th, 2003. She had 47 days left. And I say that not to be dramatic, but because I think it matters. 47 days. She was so close. And the person she trusted most, the person who had held her hand through the pregnancy, who had been photographed rubbing her belly, who had been to the Billy Bee shower, was the person who decided she was not going to reach that date. I find that specific betrayal one of the most difficult things to sit with in this entire case.
Scott Lee Peterson was born on October 24, 1972, in San Diego. He was a fertilizer salesman working for Trade Corp, a company that sold agricultural products. By most external accounts, he was charming, good-looking, and well-liked in Modesto social circles. His mother-in-law, Sharon Rocha, later said she had loved Scott. She trusted him. That trust, she would say publicly, was the most devastating part of what he did. In November 2002, 1 month before Laci disappeared, Scott began an affair with a woman named Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno. Amber later testified that Scott had told her his wife had died.
Amber's friend, who introduced her to Scott, found out that he was married and confronted him and said, "If you don't tell Amber, I will." So Scott did tell Amber.
Scott knew Amber for 16 days when he got caught being married.
He was very emotional and said that this would be the first holidays without her. And he was crying at that point. I took it as she died. Didn't know how, if, an accident or cancer, or I had no idea. I didn't pry to ask. He just said it was painful. And so I had asked if he was ready for a relationship, and he said yes.
And that he was grieving. She did not know he was married. She did not know Laci was alive and 8 months pregnant. She found out the same way the rest of the country did, when Scott Peterson became the primary suspect in his wife's disappearance and Amber saw his face on the news. Amber Frey immediately called police and began cooperating with investigators. Over the following weeks, she recorded every phone call Scott made to her, including calls he made after Laci had already been reported missing, including calls on Christmas Day 2002, including calls in which he described watching the New Year's fireworks in Paris while Laci's family was holding vigils. He was not in Paris. He was in Modesto. He lied about that too. The recorded calls are one of the most chilling elements of this case to go through. He is calling his mistress with what sounds like charming small talk, describing locations, moods, feelings, while simultaneously being the primary suspect in the disappearance of his pregnant wife. His mother-in-law is making television appeals, his wife's family is putting up flyers, and he is on the phone with Amber Frey describing the Paris skyline from a place he was not. That combination of calm and calculated behavior while the world is watching is the kind of detail that stays with you.
On December 9th, 2002, 15 days before Laci disappeared, Scott Peterson purchased a 14-foot aluminum boat. He paid with 14 $100 bills in cash. He had never owned a boat. He had never expressed interest in boating to anyone who knew him. He stored the boat in a warehouse he rented separately from the family home. He did not tell his family about the boat. He did not tell Laci's family about the boat. When he first spoke to police after Laci was reported missing, he did not mention the boat. He told them he had been fishing at the Berkeley Marina, but only identified the boat when investigators specifically asked him about it. Think about that for a second. If you genuinely went on a solo fishing trip as your alibi for where you were when your pregnant wife went missing, the boat is the first thing you mention. I have a boat. I was out testing it. Here is the boat. Here is where I went. Instead, Scott Peterson did not volunteer the boat at all. It had to be extracted from him. And when you understand what investigators found in the warehouse where that boat was stored, you understand why.
The physical evidence. What was found and where? Warehouse, boat storage. 1 homemade concrete anchor recovered. Evidence of multiple anchor production. Mold impressions and cement residue. Receipt for 90-pound bag of cement in Scott's possession. On the boat, pliers. Single strand of dark hair in the teeth of needle-nosed pliers. DNA analysis consistent with Laci Peterson's profile.
Peterson home. Pea-sized piece of concrete found in the dining room during February 2003 search. Scott's alibi? Used remaining cement to patch driveway. No driveway patching found to match the volume of missing cement. Berkeley Marina. Police canine unit picked up Laci's scent at the boat ramp, supporting theory that her body passed through that location. San Francisco Bay, April 2003. Connor's body found April 13 on the eastern shore. Laci's torso found April 14, approximately 1 mile away. Both found 2 to 3 miles north of the Berkeley Marina, where Scott claimed to have been fishing.
This is the section most people have never heard properly explained, and I think it is the most important forensic element in the entire prosecution case. So stay with me here, because it is worth understanding fully. When Laci and Connor's remains were found in April 2003, the prosecution needed to address a fundamental question. Could those bodies have gotten to that specific location in the bay through the natural movement of tides and currents, starting from the area where Scott claimed to have been fishing on December 24? They brought in Ralph Cheng, a hydrologist with the United States Geological Survey and a specialist in San Francisco Bay tidal patterns. Cheng studied the wind data, the current data, and the tidal information for the bay from December 24, 2002 through April 2003. His analysis focused primarily on Connor's body, which was lighter and therefore easier to model the trajectory of. His conclusion was that based on the tidal and wind information, the highest probability location from which Connor's body had entered the bay was the area between Brooks Island and the Berkeley Marina, which is, and this is the key detail, exactly where Scott Peterson told police he had been fishing on December 24. Now, Cheng himself was careful to say this was a highest probability finding, not a certainty. He acknowledged under cross-examination that he could not reproduce the full trajectory of Laci's body, only a probable path for Connor's, because Connor's body was smaller and unencumbered. The defense attacked his findings as conjecture, and to be fair, they had a point that this was probabilistic
rather than definitive. But here is the thing. When you combine that tidal analysis with the boat purchased 15 days before the disappearance, the cement anchors with 4 missing, the hair on the pliers, the GPS tracker, and the fact that the body surfaced exactly where Scott said he had been fishing, the probability stops being academic. Here is one of my favorite forensic details in this entire case, and it barely gets mentioned in most coverage. When investigators examined the fishing rod and tackle that Scott had brought on his so-called fishing trip, they brought in a fishing expert named Paul Kuanan to testify about what he found. Kuanang's testimony was straightforward and devastating. He looked at Scott's rod and tackle box and told the court, "This equipment is rigged for freshwater fishing, not saltwater, not bay fishing, freshwater. The rod, the line, the tackle, all of it was set up for a lake or a river, not for open water in San Francisco Bay." And the anchor Scott said he had brought, a small 5 to 10 pound concrete weight shaped like a bucket, Kuanang testified that at that time of year, with the currents running as they were in the bay, that type of anchor would not hold a boat in place. The bay's winter currents require a claw-type anchor to prevent drifting. The anchor Scott described was functionally useless for the purpose he claimed. Scott had told police that fishing was secondary on that trip, that he was primarily there to test the boat on open water. But that explanation created its own problem. Why drive 90 miles from Modesto, alone, on Christmas Eve, to test a boat you bought 15 days ago, leaving your 8 months pregnant wife at home on one of the biggest family holidays of the year? That question is the one I keep coming back to. Even if you set aside every piece of forensic evidence, the cement, the hair, the tides, you are still left with this. A man bought a boat he had never mentioned to anyone, drove 90 miles to a bay on Christmas Eve, and left his heavily pregnant wife alone at home on Christmas Eve. By itself, that is not evidence of murder. Combined with everything else, it becomes part of a picture that is very hard to explain any other way.
After Laci was reported missing, Modesto police placed GPS tracking devices on Scott Peterson's vehicles. What those devices recorded is some of the most quietly damning evidence in the entire case. Investigators physically followed Scott to the Berkeley Marina 3 times in early January 2003, in the weeks after Laci disappeared. 3 times. He drove back to the same location where he had claimed to be fishing on Christmas Eve. In January, after his wife had vanished, and he went there alone, without telling police, without any stated purpose. Prosecutors argued he was checking the bay, monitoring whether the body had surfaced, whether there was any sign of discovery, whether the anchors were holding. Scott's team argued there was an innocent explanation. The jury heard both arguments. The jury found him guilty. And there is one more GPS detail worth knowing. In the weeks after Laci's disappearance, Scott Peterson's phone data and movements showed him driving past Laci's family home and circling the block in the hours after late-night candlelight vigils for his missing wife, without stopping, without going in, without ever joining the people who were standing in the cold praying for her return. I do not know what to do with that detail, honestly. Circling the block at night after the vigils, not going in, just circling. And I know some people will say you cannot read anything into where a person drives. Maybe. But combined with everything else in this case,
it fits a pattern of someone who is managing a situation rather than grieving inside one. And I think that distinction is important. On April 18, 2003, 4 days after Laci's body was identified, Scott Peterson was arrested in La Jolla, near San Diego. He was approximately 300 miles from Modesto. When police stopped him, here is what they found. He had $15,000 in cash. He had camping equipment. He had his brother's identification documents. He had dyed his hair blonde. He had a map to Amber Frey's house and her office. His SUV had 4 cell phones. He was arrested at a golf course. He was on the 18th hole. He was golfing. 4 days after his wife's body was pulled from the bay. 4 days after Connor was identified. His family was in pieces. His mother-in-law was on television. And Scott Peterson was at a golf course in San Diego with $15,000 in cash, dyed blonde hair, and his brother's ID. His defense team called this erratic behavior caused by grief.
The prosecution called it a man about to run. The jury decided which version they believed in 7 days of deliberation. The trial, the verdict, and what has happened with Scott Peterson's appeals right up to 2026 is coming up next. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now and hit the bell. This case has had major developments as recently as April 2026, and I will be covering every update as it happens. Stay with me. Scott Peterson's trial began in June 2004 at the San Mateo County Superior Court in Redwood City, moved from Modesto because of the extraordinary media saturation of the original community. The prosecution was led by Rick DeStasso and Dave Harris. The defense was led by Mark Garagos, one of the most prominent criminal defense attorneys in
California at the time. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial. There was no murder weapon, there was no witness to the crime, there was no confession. There was no definitive cause of death established from the remains. Laci's body had been in the bay for 4 months and was too decomposed for the forensic pathologist to determine exactly how she died. What the prosecution had was the interlocking picture we have been building through this video. The boat bought secretly 15 days before, the cement anchors with 4 missing, the hair on the pliers, the title analysis placing entry into the bay at the Brooks Island Berkeley Marina area, the fishing equipment that proved he was not actually fishing, the GPS tracker showing 3 return visits to the marina, the arrest 300 miles away with cash and dyed hair.
And the affair. Amber Frey testified for the prosecution. She played the recorded phone calls in court.
Amber! Hey, Happy New Year's! I want to call you. Thank you.
What they heard on December 31st, 2002, was a Scott Peterson who, while a candlelight vigil is being held for his missing wife and he's attending it, is also on the phone with Amber Fry, being recorded unbeknownst to him, telling her that he's in Europe.
I'm near the Eiffel Tower. New Year's celebration is unreal. The crowd is huge.
The crowd's huge?
He was right down the street where the vigil was taking place.
The jury heard Scott Peterson telling his mistress he was watching Paris fireworks from a place he was not, while his mother-in-law was holding vigils for his missing wife. The defense's theory was that someone else had kidnapped and killed Laci, possibly connected to a burglary that had occurred across the street from the Peterson home on December 24. Mark Geragos argued the police had tunnel-visioned on Scott from the beginning and had not properly investigated alternative suspects. On November 12, 2004, after 7 days of deliberation, the jury found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder for Laci's death and second-degree murder for Connor's death. On March 16, 2005,
Judge Alfred DeLucci sentenced Scott Peterson to death. Scott Peterson's case has been moving through the appeals process for over 20 years. Let me walk you through the key developments, because the current situation is genuinely active, and most people do not know how far it has come. In August 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence, not because of the evidence, but for a procedural reason. The court found that prospective jurors had been improperly dismissed during jury selection because of their general opposition to the death penalty. Under U.S. case law, a juror who opposes the death penalty can still serve if they commit to following the law and their oath. Judge DeLucci had dismissed too many such jurors. The conviction itself was upheld. The death sentence was thrown out. In December 2021, Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He's currently held at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California. In December 2021, Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He's currently held at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California.
In January 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project took up Scott Peterson's case. The LAIP, which has helped exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals across California, filed motions requesting DNA testing of disputed evidence, including a mattress found in a burned-out car near the Peterson home and a hammer. Their argument is that this evidence could support the theory that someone else was responsible for Laci's death. In August 2025, the LAIP filed a formal habeas petition alleging Peterson was wrongfully convicted based on what it described as false evidence. In October 2025, the court granted Peterson access to more than 600 pieces of evidence for post-conviction discovery. However, in April 2026, the latest chapter of this legal saga played out. A California appeals court denied the LAIP's petition. The court rejected the claim that the evidence amounted to a viable path to exoneration. The LAIP has pledged to continue fighting and is now taking the case to the California Supreme Court. Scott Peterson also has a separate appeal pending in the California Supreme Court alleging juror misconduct, specifically that a juror provided false answers on her questionnaire. Legal expert Nima Rahmani, speaking to Fox News in December 2025, offered a clear-eyed assessment. I don't think it's a particularly good shot, and I do expect Scott Peterson to die in California State Prison. Remember when I mentioned at the very beginning that the alibi was going fishing and that the Bay knew better? 23 years later, Scott Peterson is still in prison. The Innocence Project is still filing motions, and the Bay keeps being the central point in every argument.
Every appeal, every motion, every piece of new evidence, it all comes back to what happened between Brooks Island and the Berkeley Marina on Christmas Eve 2002. And the tides of San Francisco Bay have not changed their story. I want to spend a moment on why the forensic angle in this case matters, beyond just what it proved in a courtroom.
The Scott Peterson case is often described as a circumstantial case, as if that means the evidence was weak. But circumstantial evidence, when there is enough of it, when it all points in the same direction, when each piece independently corroborates every other piece, is how the vast majority of murders are actually prosecuted. Direct evidence is a witness to the crime, or a confession. Most murders do not produce either. What prosecutors have instead is a pattern. And in this case, the pattern was consistent, specific, and documented. A boat bought secretly in cash 15 days before the disappearance.
Cement anchors made in a warehouse and mostly missing? A hair on the pliers? A fishing rod rigged for the wrong type of water? An anchor too small to hold in bay currents? Tidal science placing the entry point exactly at his claimed location? 3 GPS-tracked return visits to the marina? An arrest 300 miles away with dyed hair and his brother's ID? None of those individual facts convict anyone alone. Together, they construct something that is very difficult to explain without concluding what the jury concluded: that Scott Peterson killed his wife, transported her body to San Francisco Bay in a large toolbox, dumped it weighted with homemade concrete anchors, and drove back to Modesto to begin the
given interviews, and spent more than 2 decades making sure her daughter is not forgotten in the bureaucratic machinery of a case that keeps going back to court. She said something in an interview that has stayed with me. She said that every single day she thinks about Laci, and that she will never understand how the person Laci loved most was capable of doing what he did to her. Neither will I. Laci Denise Peterson, 27 years old, 47 days from meeting her son. Connor Lee Peterson. He never had a chance. That is all for today. Thanks for watching.